my dear friends. Today we have what I think of as a thorny passage. In other words, it's a passage that I don't quite know what to make of. It's good to have passages like this, because if we didn't have them, we might be tempted to think we've found all the answers, and that is a great spiritual snare. It's the definition of being a Pharisee, if you ask me. So why is this a thorny passage? Jesus is affirming the value of the law and saying that nothing in the law is to be removed, not a jot or a tittle, not one iota, the smallest letter. Well, at the Council of Jerusalem, and throughout all Christian history, Gentile Christians, which is pretty much all of us, have not felt bound by all the details of the law. We are not bound to circumcise male children on the 8th day. We do not feel bound to the dietary laws or the regulations around sacrifice. Are we then the least in the kingdom of heaven, according to what Jesus teaches here? Well, perhaps we are. But I want to share 3 thoughts with you today, which don't, at least to me, add up to a complete answer, but they do work together to make the thorn of this passage a little less painful to cope with. The first point is the context. Jesus is teaching his disciples. The Sermon on the Mount is not delivered to a large crowd, despite how it's often portrayed in films. So is a teaching given to a group of Jewish men a teaching that is universal for everyone at all time, or is it restricted to those men at that particular time? It's certainly a teaching that will be received by them in a much more direct and immediate fashion than it could ever be received by us. The second point is that the law is rightly understood as a gift from God. To keep the law is to enjoy the gift, to receive it as a means of grace. I like to think of the law as an instruction set, a bit like what you might get with flat pack furniture. If you follow the instructions, then everything finds its proper place and it all works. And that applies to our lives too. So perhaps we need to hear the tone in which Jesus is saying this. It's a tone filled with grace. It's not a burden. My last point is a bit more speculative. In other words, I need to do a bit of research to find out if this thought is leading me in the right direction, but I think it's still worth sharing. When I was reflecting on this passage, I was struck by verse 18 that talks about until heaven and earth disappear, which I've usually thought of as simply a way of saying forever. The thought that struck me was that one way of understanding heaven and earth disappearing is to say that the division between heaven and earth disappears. There's no longer separation between them. And this is what is symbolized by the curtain in the temple being torn in two on Good Friday. Heaven, which is the Holy of Holies behind the curtain, is no longer separate from earth, the creation, which is the rest of the temple where the people gather. In other words, perhaps Jesus here is saying that the law applies until people are born again. I need to think about that a bit more. So, 3 thoughts today about a thorny passage. But thanks be to God for thorny passages, because as we wrestle with them, we draw closer to God, and He draws closer to us. Until we meet again. Amen.